My name's Jan Pearce, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm one of the programme managers in NHS IMAS, and I have responsibility for pool member development. And this webinar is part of our series of pool member development webinars. A couple of housekeeping points, if I may, before I introduce Paul, who's our speaker for today. All microphones will be muted during the session. Your choice whether you keep your camera on or off during it. And to help manage the time, if it's okay today, we would like to keep all questions to the end, please. If there's anything burning or any pressing point that occurs to you as we go through, if you drop something in the chat, we can always come back to that later. And at the very end of the session, there will be an opportunity to fill in a brief evaluation form if you have a couple of minutes to spare. So that's the housekeeping. So without further ado, I want to say welcome to our speaker for today. We're delighted to have with us Paul Corrigan. Paul is an experienced senior manager and policy advisor, and he's got nationally recognised expertise in policy and practice in relation to reforming public services. So he's going to talk to us today specifically about developing and using a narrative to create a new model of care. So I'll hand over to you, Paul. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Janet. I'm doing this talk on the assumption that all of us who are both giving and listening to the talk have jobs where we do some work for clients, and those clients expect, as a result of the work we do, some form of change. Sometimes big changes, some little changes, but they expect that having asked us to do something different will happen. And we are generally restricted to not a lot of contact with the things we're expected to change, and sometimes it feels as if we're expected to be a bit magical about how we bring that about. But actually, one of the things I want to foreground here is that whilst in most of my career, the output that I've been involved in is a policy paper or a plan, most of the successful change takes place if there's something alongside of that, which the people that the plan is meant to mobilize or the policy is meant to implement, if those people feel there is some purpose to this, and that's what I'm referring to as a narrative. I studied social policy a long time ago, 50 years ago at the LSE, and was taught by the great social policy post-war people, Richard Titmuss and others. And I was taught really the importance of planning and what a gift that was to changing the world. And over that period of time, I spent a lot of time in policy departments, in local government, in various places, and then in 2001, I went to be a policy advisor, a special advisor to new Labour secretaries of state in health, and then to Tony Blair on the same issue. And what I want to draw out from that, and it's not the burden of my talk, the burden of my talk is about something more practical, is that what New Labour had and what I walked into is that all the time they were constructing really quite complicated things that we were doing in NHS reform in an overall narrative. There was a story going on here. And the story contained something which probably meant something like this: we love the NHS so much, we've got to change it. And that was really quite a simple narrative, but quite a complex narrative, because most people said we love the NHS so much, we want to leave it as it is. And so we were trying all the time to point out how the necessity of change, and who was involved in that necessity of change, was also creating a sustainable NHS. And I worked then with people who just did narratives. They were seen as spin doctors, they were seen as all sorts of things, but their job would be to come in and say, what's all this policy stuff, Paul? How can we explain it to people? And my job with them was trying to work out how you explain it all to people. So I learnt narrative in political change. And then I left working for government and started to work for myself as a consultant. And really, I sort of went back to producing plans. And this piece of work is taken from quite a long bit of work I did as a consultant, working for Sam Jones, who was creating new models of care. And she asked me to work with the GPs that were constructing what was horizontal integration, called at the time multidisciplinary community providers, MCPs. And there were 14 people that won the right to create this new model of care. And my job was to meet with them every month in a sort of action learning set. So this really came from that experience. And it came from that experience because I worked with them for 3 years, which is a lot of meetings. And you talk about, one of the main things we talked about every meeting was what difference has happened in the last month for patients. And there was a lot of scratching of heads because sometimes not a lot had happened for patients. But if that went on for 6 months, if someone said, no, we've done nothing for patients in this change process for 6 months, everybody got a bit worried. So in a sense, the rooting of what this thing was about, there was a thing called a new model of care. There was lots of PowerPoint decks around the new model of care. There was lots of stuff that people were doing, but actually why was all this happening was rooted in something that had to change for patients. Now, that's a pretty obvious thing, but actually a lot of my work in consulting with the NHS often doesn't refer to patients because it's just in the organizational stuff at the center of everything, and you leave patients out of it. So what this deck is about, we move on to the next slide if we may, is simply saying that there was a series of localities looking at how we were going to do this. The slide's not moved on for me. And
sorry, here we go, Paul. I just wanted to check that Rosa was with us. Yeah.
And so this is where this particular narrative comes from. I'd just like to emphasize the reason for these slides is looking at something which I thought you would all have come across, which is the new models of care thing. So we're not talking about something esoteric, but actually these are principles that can be used in all sorts of narratives. And one of the reasons for doing this is all of us that are engaged in change recognize, and this is in the last but one line, that what we're searching for all the time is renewable sources of energy. People start off saying, yes, we really need to do this, and run out of puff, because actually, whilst they want to do it, there's whole reasons why not to do it. And so the renewable source of energy is finding ways of motivating people. And I've found that no plan or policy actually seems to work as a motivator. You don't often get people going to the wall for a policy document. But you might for a story. Next slide, please. And so those organizations that want to maintain change have been using the creation of narratives as a change process for some time. And one of the things I think those of us consulting in the NHS makes us all hesitate, certainly makes me hesitate, is you feel you are constructing something which is outside of the sort of thing we should be doing. So when you go to people and you say, you're paying me a consultancy fee in order to help you tell a story, you can see them wince a bit and say, no, that's not what we're paying you to write a policy document. And so you have to find a reason to talk about narratives. People don't naturally find it easy. I did a piece of work earlier on this year where I was interviewing 6 chief executives who were in turnaround trusts. And all I did with this is said what they did on day 1, what they did on day 2, what they did on day 3. And Roy Lilly, when he was doing his normal thing of mildly taking the piss out of things, said what was interesting about reading this is it was like a novel. And that was the first time I thought, well, this really does work, because actually it was meant to be read like a story that people could see the way through. And so next slide, please. This is really the 10 stages of constructing a narrative. The narrative about new model of care is one which is very, very with us today still, because the new model of care was an attempt to overcome fragmentation and to create some form of integration. The integration, the fragmentation that exists within the NHS and between the NHS and other sets of services is enormous, very considerable and very powerful. And in fact, one of the distressing things about the truth between 2018 and the present day is there's probably more fragmentation today because there are more specialisms than there was when we started off trying to do integration. So a person who is a passionate diabetes consultant, it's really good they're passionate about their diabetes consultant. But that passion, and this is their narrative at the moment, they come into work and they worry about improving people with diabetes, that passion doesn't run to the fact that about a third of the people they're talking to also have other long-term conditions. So fragmentation, I'm afraid, can be created by the fact that people are passionate about the thing they do and aren't bothering about the other things that impact on the patient. So the existing narrative, the story of now, which is the sort of beginning of how you construct a narrative, is what stories have people got when they come to work. That diabetes consultant comes to work and probably does an incredibly good job in working with people with diabetes to improve that. And he or she may have studied for 12 years to do that. And if you say no, you've got to get your head around coronary, around COPD and around arthritis, because that's what the person in front of you has got. They say, do I have to study that for 12 years? Do I have to do that? And so the current story, which people are very passionate about, is really creating a very bad story for the patient. And what you can't do is say to somebody, oh, your story is wrong, because that's the story they trained for and have committed their lives to do. So you need to, as we're changing narratives, you need to recognize, and this is another word we don't use, that people really love their current narrative. It really is what motivates them to do their thing. But unfortunately, their thing is, we will know, is fragmented from lots of other things. And if we're asking that diabetes consultant to do something different, I think the burden of what I'm suggesting is we need another story they can be passionate about as the story of me coming into work and helping people with their diabetes. And that is searching for, at the moment, that consultant's passion, and their implementation is implementing a fragmented care service, which we're trying to change. And so we need to find a way of talking to a different passion and a different story. And so that's where narratives come from. It's not that it's currently everybody has their story. We're not imposing the idea of a narrative. People do come to work with a story, and that work is, in this particular case we're looking at, is fragmenting people. Next slide, please. So that means first point here, we need to know what the current story people are working within. And you'll need a new story to make that work. And one of the things here is that patients and generally go to work and are met by patients who really do thank them a lot. And so thank you very much for your work with my diabetes. It's been helping me a great deal. And very rarely will they say, but it's a bit strange you're not talking to me about my arthritis or about my COPD. And so the doctor and the nurse sometimes doesn't experience the problems that are caused by their narrative in the lives of the patients. And we need to find a way of the patient actually, in a sense, waving a bit and saying, and please don't forget about my COPD and my arthritis. Please don't chop me up. And one of the ways in which the NHS deals with this is they might say, well, actually, all the people in this are wonderful people. All the staff are wonderful people. It's the organizations that are a problem. And actually, it's true the organizations of fragmentation are a problem, but so are people's individual stories. So are people's individual passions. And often when we're going in to bring about change, we say to the people, we say to the staff, it's not you that's got to change. It's actually the organization that's got to change. I'm afraid in the issue of integration, the staff have to change as well. And a lot of the times I remember those words coming out of my mouth, which is saying, no, it's the organization that has to change. is generally not true, even when the words come out of my mouth. So before you develop a story about a new model of care, you need to give weight to and understand the power of the existing stories that we're going to change. Next slide, please. And one of the ways in which this took place in 2015 is finding ways, and this I think is a narrative for most of the change within public services, but within the NHS in particular, finding ways of demonstrating the life of the patient in the story of the staff that are carrying out this work. So again, back to the person with diabetes, it's not they don't care about the arthritis and the COPD. It's just it's rarely presented to them, and so the comorbidities, which actually is whatever we say about the NHS, the core customer is a 78-year-old person with 3 long-term conditions. That takes up 3/4 of the money. And so dealing with this is not a peripheral issue, it's the core issue. How do we get the patient voice into this? And the next slide was one of the things that NHSE did in 2015. And they went to National Voices and asked for a series of statements from patients about their experience of care. And it was interesting, this is 2015, and these are what the public came back with. And they proved to be very, very useful in this particular piece of work, but quite frankly, have been very useful in every bit of work I've done with the National Health Service since. Because actually, in terms of a set of patient demands, these are not extreme. In terms of the change that needs to come about to make them happen, they're very extreme. But in terms of what a patient wants, I would like all my needs as a person are assessed. Now, that is not an unreasonable thing for someone to ask for, but actually, given the structure of the way in which we structure services, it's incredibly, you would hear people say, but that's completely unreasonable. No, it isn't completely unreasonable. I can decide the kind of support I need and how to receive it. Now that, again, in most areas of life, that is not an extreme thing for people to want. It's how I live my life. But actually, in a lot of areas of healthcare, I'm not allowed to decide the kind of support I need and how I receive it. I'm listened to about what works for me in my life. I'm as involved in discussions and decisions about my care, support and treatment as I want to be. When I move between services or settings, there's a plan in place for what happens next. These are perfectly normal things which people have got. Again, it's not extreme to ask for, but actually making them happen is very, very hard. And so part of what I'm saying is that finding ways in which these simple, I think probably underneath what I'm saying is patients really don't ask for much. Asking for these things are themselves bring about a great deal of change. So under those circumstances, these statements, which I commend you enormously, are things which you can pose as part of a patient's story to anybody in the NHS involved in any part of their story. And given that a large chunk of what we do should in the end in some way relate to what patients want, this begins to get into that consultant who's an expert in diabetes. It begins to confront them with a wider story. And what's interesting is, having done that quite a few times, the consultant hovers between this is completely unreasonable to saying, actually, no, it isn't really, is it? But actually, it means I've got to change my practice a lot. So you're using, occasions that doesn't work. Occasions people say, I don't care. But mainly, people do want to know what patients are saying, and simply presenting a different narrative that comes from a different place begins to construct, in the wider term, what a bigger narrative might look like that includes the staff and isn't just using the parents, the patients to bring about that change. One concrete example, when I went around doing work just before this with the Better Care Fund, which also went around the country talking to local authorities and to the NHS. Torbay, that did integrated care probably earlier than most other places, what they did in Torbay is they had a typical patient, Mary, she was called, and you had people in meetings saying, and what would Mary think about this? And when you sit in on these meetings, you think, what on earth are they talking about? But it is actually saying this Mary is being presented into that. So somehow or another, getting a patient narrative into the internal narrative of the NHS. There's loads of different ways of doing it, but actually sometimes having a typified patient there who you can refer to. And so here we are, we're discussing financial flows with financial people. It's incredibly detailed. What would Mary think about this? Well, does she have to know? Well, perhaps she does, right? So all the time, finding ways of representing patients into that narrative is one of the first ways of building an alternative narrative. Next slide, please. And you begin to develop, I think, mainly, in fact, very, very often, when I've got to this stage where staff are listening to what patients have said and finding it a bit painful, they want to construct a different story. They want to find a way of finding what they need to do. Could we move on to the next one, please? And so you start to talk to staff about the narrative they're in and the problems it's got, the problems it's creating for Mary, the problems it's creating for what the patients want with those simple I statements. And you then start to get the staff looking at how the current narrative works within the existing model of care and what problems that contains for the public narrative. And how would their particular work, in the second point here, work with the new model of care? Okay, so you're asking us to work with a range of other people. How are we going to tell that story? How are we going to tell the story to one of the best ways that happens in the NHS is a doctor or a nurse says to the patient, you're my patient and I'm going to look after you. Actually, you're not my patient because I share you with about 5 other people. And so therefore, how do you create the ownership, the my part of that, without losing a commitment that the staff have got to patients? How do you, am I committed to something amorphous? No, I'm committed to Mary, and Mary's got 3 long-term conditions. How do I construct my story from that bit? And how do we move from the current one, with all of that commitment to separation, to another narrative which contains a story of all of us working together? And the only reason we're working together, not because we like each other, although that might be the case, we're working together because the patient needs that to happen. And so the motivation for this has to come from the staff, but the only way I've found they can really get much of a motivation from this is to recognize the motivation comes initially from the patients. And so wanting to achieve a new model of care isn't abstract. Why should anyone go to what I'm doing today? I'm creating a new model of care. No, what I'm creating today is a model of care which tries to treat patients as whole people, and provides me, because I have a better relationship with the patient, with more fulfilling work experiences. If at this stage we have got a narrative which has the patient's view in some way opposed to the staff view, we have to go around and do it again. If the staff are simply saying, well, I'm only doing this because the patients are telling me to, then you've not found a motivation within that staff's heart and minds, and you need to go around again. So whilst I'm all in favour of patient-led narratives, if we're going to bring about change in the NHS, it must involve a staff-led narrative. So what I'm doing here is saying, if you get to the end of where we are here and people say, I'm only doing this for patients, it's not going to work. you have to find a way where the motivation, the renewable energy, comes from the staff as well. Next slide as well, please. And so you'll need, one of the interesting things about developing this narrative is for it to work, you're going to have to start to use it. You as a change agent and some of the staff are going to have to use it in all sorts of different settings. And you're going to have to use it in a way which constructs an argument for change. And so someone might come in and say, well, what we need in order to deal with these people with 3 long-term conditions is a hyper acute specialist. We need another specialist to come in and deal with that. And you then need to say, how does bringing in a specialist fit in with the overall narrative of bringing people together? Honestly, that's an example which has happened a lot. I've seen people bring in specialists in order to create integration. I know it sounds a bit odd, but it does happen. So you need to use, and others need to start using, what does this narrative look like? And the reason for doing this is the only point of this narrative is to persuade other people. In the early 2000s, when the NHS was doing lots and lots of configurations, some of you may have come across this. One of the phrases the NHS used is every reconfiguration needed a compelling case for change. And it was used, as these things are, as one word, a compelling case for change. And I was going around the country talking to people about configurations, and they would come to me and say, the problem with our compelling case for change is no one seems to agree with it. Now, that means you've got a problem. A, it's not very compelling. You can call it compelling, but if no one agrees with it, it's not compelling. You can say we've got a brand new, wonderful narrative here, but if no one agrees with it, it doesn't work. So the trying out of the narrative in lots and lots of different places is to construct, how do we use this as a way which persuades other people to do it? And so given that, as I put here, usually we're bringing out change through a PowerPoint, as we are here, how do you inject a bit of a narrative form into that PowerPoint? How do you get, as I've said here, in Sunderland, it wasn't Mary, it was Jack. Does this do anything for Jack? So what you're trying to do is all of the meetings that are going on about the new model of care or about the change you're bringing about, you're trying to inject some bits of a narrative into that, and you realize that sometimes it just doesn't work, in which case you need to find a different way of doing it. So there's an engine room in this slide, which is if you just write out your narrative in a pretty slide on your own, it's not going to work. It needs to get in there into the guts of change and see how it works. Next slide, please. And so initially, when you're working with people to develop this narrative, some will say, you know, this really makes sense. I can see how this is going to bring about change. And you start to get a group of people who are evangelical about the nature of the narrative. And it becomes their task to talk to other people about this. In a sense, once you've got a cadre of people that say, this is quite a good way of doing it, you need, therefore, to get them talking about it. And because what we're engaged in most of the changes we're doing is usually, even if they're quite small changes, they're quite large. They're quite large. There's a lot of change has to happen for a little change to happen. And so, for example, a narrative that I've used here, an example I've used here is when GPs talk to each other about integrated care, they talk about something entirely different than community nurses. They really do. They may be talking about the same integrated care, but the narrative needs to work with very different groups of people. It needs to work with finance directors. It needs to work with community nurses. It needs to work with social care people. And so all the time with your narrative, you're trying out with different groups and trying to get people to understand it. And the new model of care ended up touching very, very many different sorts of practitioners in the NHS. And it also needs to involve patients in that. And I've got the example here, children with asthma or the frail elderly. All of these people need to be a part of that narrative. And certainly when you're doing this, going to patient organisations. So with frail elderly, I just do a lot of work with Local Age UK. and say, does this work? Is this the sort of thing that older people believe? Can we go and have a discussion with them when they talk about services? Is this the language they use? So this slide is about building and building and building. The previous slide was about trying it out all the time, and this is making sure you build it and build it and build it. Next slide, please. And using it over and over again, and trying to make it a normal part of activity. And what does that mean? So people will go into work and they might say, you know, I talked to Paul Corrigan, who's an old guy who's very troublesome in Greenwich. And, you know, he was really interested in the fact that he can now not have to see two consultants, that one consultant will deal with both those things. And how do we get Paul to talk to other patients about that? And don't get upset. Persistence is all at this stage. Don't get upset if people don't get it, because all the time you're talking to more and more people, and it's new. It's a new story. That particular Paul Corrigan has got his own narrative about his own illnesses, and he may like going to 3 different consultants. And he may like the fact that he's getting all of that stuff out of the NHS he's paid for all this time. So you have to use the narrative over and over again. And there's this great moment, which does happen if this begins to work, where someone comes up to you and says, you know, Paul, what we're doing here is constructing an integrated care service. I don't know if you've heard about this, but that's what we're trying to do. And so you hear the narrative come back at you. And that means people have begun to internalize it as the way in which they make sense of their work. Next slide, please. So what starts to happen if this begins to work is that not only are people talking about things differently, but different things are happening. So patients might get puzzled by the fact, if you look back at the I statements, that someone says to them, does this fit in with the way in which you're living your life? Does this fit in with how you want to see your future? And that when that starts to happen, people are beginning to practice on the narrative, and it begins to have very much a life and formation of its own. But the way in which you get to people doing something different in this particular way of working is you give them a different story, and they then do something different within that story and talk about what they're doing in a different way. What happens, and this is the middle paragraph here, is that people will start to internalize this narrative in a different way from the words that you started off using. It loses its purity, because people will say, I don't know what all this integrated care malarkey is about, but I do realize we're working more together now. And that can be, there's quite a difficult moment there as a change agent, because actually you've lost it and it is owned by other people. Good thing, and you cannot control this narrative as it gets going. They'll be responsible for this, but they will be carrying it and doing it on their own, in their own way and their own form. Next slide, please. And so making sure that it works and engages with new people all the time. So there will always be people who haven't heard the narrative, and that this is spreading out all the time. You probably need, and this is what I talk about renewable energy, you probably need somewhere in this whole program, someone who's trying to hold the narrative, someone whose job it is. Now, interestingly, in other forms of change, we call this the PMO office. So there they are, looking at all the aspects of change with enormous Gantt charts and working out whether things are actually happening, whether things are working out. You could have someone similar looking at the narrative. Has it really reached, let's say, the district nurses in that particular area, or are they carrying on working? Do we know how they're talking about it? So somebody like a PMO person needs to be in charge of this. And I'm suggesting just at the end of this, after 6 months, you need someone to say, okay, just as they would a program management office, has the change happened? You would say, has the narrative taken hold? Does it matter? Are people using it? Do we need to change it? So you're evaluating this as you'd evaluate any other change agent. Thanks a lot. Any questions?
Thank you very much for that insight, Paul. Really, really helpful and interesting. This is the section where there is an opportunity to ask questions, and I think the best way to manage that is if we raise hands in the usual way, and I'll invite you to speak. You can unmute yourself, hopefully, and choose whether or not to turn on your camera. Just to get us started, Paul, it brought to mind a couple of things that I've observed over the years in terms of change, and there must have been an underpinning narrative. I'm thinking particularly of there was a drive to get people, medical staff in hospitals, to introduce themselves and say, hello, my name is. And I think that must have been underpinned by quite a strong, powerful narrative, because that wasn't there before. So, and I also used to work myself in personalised care and support planning a few years ago, and I know from personal experience that just because you say you want everyone to have a personalised care and support plan doesn't mean they're going to get one. And trying to encourage clinicians, and I don't know if anybody on the call's got experience of this, to say what matters to you rather than what is the matter with you. And I don't know if that narrative is trying to be progressed, but it's certainly something that makes the patient, the person with the condition or the lived experience, feel as if they're involved in their care and have got some sort of sense of empowerment, that they can help to shape their care plan and any decisions made about their care. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that while others are gathering their questions together.
Both of those concrete examples, hello, I'm Paul Corrigan, and what can I do for you? How can we improve
what matters to you? What matters to you? Yeah.
Rather than what's the matter
with you? Yeah.
Both of them, both of them are often a challenge to what people have learnt is correct medical practice, correct clinical practice. So a lot of clinicians I know that are older were taught it was very important to have a separation between you and your patients. And so the notion of personal names had to be learnt. It's a very odd thing. I mean, they didn't have to be learnt when they were talking to their relatives, but it had to be learnt when they were talking to their patients, because actually they'd been taught about that separation. So again, back to my point, they had a story in their lives which had a rationale. And I could be pretty dismissive of them not saying their name, but there was a reason for it. It wasn't that they were nasty people. There was a reason for it. And the same is true with what matters to you, that when you are a clinician and you say that what's going to happen is a broadening out. And here am I've got 10 minutes with you, and I really, really want to help. And so what I've been taught is to zoom in rather than to broaden out. And so we are through these quite correct new narratives, and I think they will, in the end, save the NHS lots and lots of resources by broadening out. We're going against an existing narrative that people have the reasons for having, which are perfectly good reasons. So the thing that I've learned is to have this is the word I've been searching for to have a big empathy with why people don't think the way in which I think. And to think there's really good reasons why you do this that are to do with the fact you're a good person, and how do we change that good person thing into another good person. So here we are on this particular afternoon, what proportion of clinicians are saying what matters to you? I'd say under 10%. But it's 10% more than it was a while ago. How many people are giving you their name? About 95%. I think now that's become and a much more. So in a sense, these are, if you take those two narratives, one has become nearly universalized, and the other one has got a long way to go.
Thank you. Are there any questions that have sprung to mind while we've been just chatting about those 2 points? If you wanted to raise your hand. So Robert's asked a question in the chat box, but he's just saying that he's leaving. Yeah, so it's about, Robert's just mentioned about engaging stakeholders to take ownership of change. And just on the point I think you made earlier in your presentation, Paul, you mentioned national voices and also the need really, if we can, to work in co-production. I don't know if that's still a term that's used out there, but certainly when I was in care planning, we had lots of people that we worked in co-production with. So just designing the care plan, for instance, we had a team of people that we could test things out on, seek their views. And again, I suppose underpinning it and not really realizing at the time, it was helping to inform the narrative based on what you've said now. That's helped me to understand that.
What you're doing, I think, with co-production is introducing into the narrative voices that are rarely heard. And so the I statements were voices that were rarely heard, and I find them. I rarely find people that say, "No, I'm not going to do that." But so introducing voices in is a way of saying, if we're going to make sense of all of this, we've got to hear those voices as well. If we exclude those voices, what are we doing? So I think all the move towards co-production and involving different voices in is a way of starting creating a new narrative.
Thank you, that's helpful. And just in terms of sort of drawing it back into the IMAS arena, we can use narratives presumably to influence any type of stakeholder. It doesn't have to be a patient or a person with lived experience. We can use the concept to engage people and help to try and shift things is really what we're saying, isn't it?
So when someone says to me, Paul, I'd like you to do this piece of work, I will ask a lot of why questions to get their input to the narrative. And sometimes they'll say, I'd like to do this piece of work because we're being told to do it. And that's not a very, that probably means the work's not going to work. So you need to find the motivation, the story in that. So we're asking you, Paul, to do this bit of change because we think the change is going to be important. Why? What's important about these changes? So the odd thing is, I often find with clients, you need to do co-production with them about why are you asking this? What's the significance in your lives, in the lives of your organization? How can we then begin? Because you're saying you want me, Paul, to be involved in this bit of change. What's it for? Why? And so I find asking them, oddly, as a stakeholder, an employer, a really crucial part of this. And sometimes you don't get much back, and that means it's quite difficult to do the job.
Yeah, just following on from that, Paul, Denise has asked an interesting question in the chat box. She mentions that she thinks that this could be quite a slow process, and then compared to the speed that we're expected to implement change, there might be a bit of a mismatch there. And she wonders if you've got any tips for maybe speeding things up or being efficient in terms of adopting this approach. And then I'll come to you, Andy, after we've done this one. Thank you.
Yeah. It was the same question, actually, which was about the timescale and how one manages. Clearly, best practice suggests this, and that's N months, and I'd be interested what N is, whereas actually doing this really well takes 6N or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I think that's, so how do you do this when you're being asked to do something in a month? Let's just take that as a parameter. And it's right, that's often a piece of work. Well, again, I think in that month you'll have lots of meetings with people, and they think they're meeting you about the nuts and bolts of change. How can you do this? How can you do this? And so they're talking to you as an engineer, and they think you're talking to them as engineers, and you're doing that nuts and boltsy sorts of thing. I find it quite straightforward in the middle of all of that to say, why are we doing this? What's the point of this? Right? Remind me again, what's the point of this? And to try and get them to answer the bigger questions. And it often is, we've got to do some efficiency saving. Okay. And what's that for? Right. So all the time, I think just asking, so here we are in the middle of doing nuts and bolts. And I often find I can, I don't know, 20 minutes in, say, you know, and you do the humble bit, you know, I just don't know what's going on here. Why are we doing this? Why? Because it looks quite hard. What's the purpose of this? What do we hope to achieve? What might it give to patients? And sometimes people have thought about that, and sometimes they haven't. So you are an agent provocateur getting from them some sentences, and they will often say, well, I know we're being told to do this, but 6 months ago, I was doing a similar piece of work, and I was doing it because actually I felt we really needed to bring these two bits of things together. And why is that? And so I think getting away from the mechanics into the why is trying to understand how their motivation to do this piece of work, and then I, coming back to the next meeting in a month with these people, you say, I know you said you're doing it for these reasons, but there's these other reasons. And I find it's in an hour's meeting, you can do quite a lot of this in 7 or 8 minutes, and still get on with the engineering stuff that you're meant to be doing. And people quite like it. They don't say, I want to get back to the gubbins, so I think it's just asking why questions. Why are we doing this? What's important about it? Have you got any idea about how this would be better for patients? And sometimes they look at you a bit gone out, and sometimes they'll answer the question. So I think if someone said, how do you do this in a month? You don't do it as well, but you can get, you could say, here we are, we're doing something about changing financial flows in a system. Is it all right if I went to talk to some patients about this? And someone's got to say no to that, which is quite a difficult thing to do. And then you come back to the patient and say, well, and so all the time, what I think you're doing, and with a purpose, is to try and reframe away from a nuts and bolts into a bigger story. Because I think people generally don't do very much for a nut and a bolt.
Thank you, Paul. That's helpful. Mick, do you want to ask your question if you're able to unmute your microphone? Don't know if you can do that. We can try and do it for you.
Yeah, thank you.
You've done it. Well done. We can hear you.
Yeah. So I apologise for being late to join, but I've probably joined at about the right time, because I think this issue about what I would almost term as instant gratification of the commissioner for wanting something done now, with actually making sure that whatever we do is sustainable in the long term, is actually the fundamental basis of this. And I can't see how you can ever really hope to be embedding something that's going to last after you walk away from it if you haven't bought into the views of all of the stakeholders. And certainly for me, whatever I've done, right back even to some of the most difficult things I've done around homicide inquiries and so on, I think the telling point for me afterwards is, can everybody see there's a little bit of what they said in the consultation process that's now reflected in the outcome? So they're all bought into it. And if you can really get that buy-in, you can walk away and you can come back in 5 years and you can still see something that's almost what you were trying to do with that group of people. So it's not about you making the change, it's about you facilitating the change on behalf of
But-
the people that you're doing it with.
And the sustainability comes, which is the first part of your question, from the fact that they will continue the work when you've left.
Absolutely.
And so you and in with your stakeholder group, there'll be different responses to that, right?
Yeah.
You do very well if they all think, yeah, let's carry on with this, right? But you do very badly if none of them do. It'll be a pointless exercise if none of them do, right? So it seems to be part of what I was saying in the previous thing about talking to everybody about why, even the mechanics about why, is you pick up that some people have got quite a big why here, and really are bought in already, and you nurture that as a part of a bigger why. And they, as stakeholders, and I think probably to unpack what I mean by nurture, is I think you're challenging the stakeholders as well as listening to them. So, you are saying, okay, take a homicide inquiry, one of the great, just watching people on the telly about that is, a film of the mum and the dad, they're pretty motivated, and they're pretty motivated to see the thing through. But if they're just motivated for themselves because of the loss of their daughter or son, it doesn't come out as a change. No. So in a sense, what I've done, I've never done a murder inquiry. I haven't got the nerve, quite frankly. But it seems to me what I've done with people who've suffered a lot is actually tried to detract from the personalization of that suffering into a wider set of issues, so that in fact you can then, when I'm gone, carry this forward, not just about your little Paul, but about wider sets of things. So I find in my example of listening to the engineer early on is what you're doing is you're challenging back as well, because if they had their own narrative for change, there probably wouldn't be much point you being there. They would have a narrative of change which wouldn't work in some way. So I think you're exactly right. You'll go around the stakeholders and try and construct what the narrative for change is, and then you're doing that in such a way as I think to embolden it, change it, but you are helping them because we've got experience of doing this. All they've got is their pain often.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks, Mick, for your question, and thanks, Paul, for that helpful answer. I'm going to start to draw it to a close now, unless there are any other burning questions. So, Richard, please do come in.
Thank you. Just a very quick comment on what you've been saying, which I do find really interesting and thought-provoking. And I've been thinking a lot about patients wanting to see a GP and how they get access to the GP. And it seems to me that both patients and professionals, of course, have several conflicting narratives going on in their head. And so a patient might be saying, I need to see a doctor. And they might also be saying and be believing, you can never see a doctor nowadays. Yeah. And there might be a third narrative about, unless I see the doctor rather than the nurse, and unless I see the doctor in person, it's not a real appointment and I don't get what I need. And so I can begin to see that developing one narrative to replace a single narrative is something. So let's drink Pepsi rather than drinking Coke. But developing one narrative to replace several and often quite conflicting narratives, it's all quite hard, isn't it?
Yeah. But if you don't do it, I don't think, to take the concrete example you're looking at, I don't think you bring about that change. The one bit of that work that I've done quite a bit of work with is with the GPs themselves. And they have, and you'll hear the frustration in me saying this, they have very weird narratives, because the first thing they'll say is, I'm incredibly busy. I don't get to see my family. I want to leave. I'm so busy. And the second thing they'll say is, don't you ever take anything away from me. don't you give it to somebody else, right? And so I played that backwards and forwards to them, and usually after the third or fourth time they will laugh, because they get the fact that that is absurd. And so you say, well, now what can we do about this, eh? Because you're working yourself awfully, but you won't give anything up. How can we help you to give something up, right? And with patients, it's what you want to see is 15 minutes with a GP, and what you get at the moment is often nothing. Further down the line, what we found is if you do get to see a nurse for 15 minutes, you're very happy to see the nurse the second time. I don't know the same about, except for a younger generation, where there is a lot of evidence that the video stuff and the telephone consultancy is fantastic. But we have in medicine the magic of a hands-on relationship, and so I can with an 80-year-old woman, I can construct a narrative about when you see the nurse, you'll get on with her. Oh, okay, let's see, and then they think you were right. What I've not seen is it's just as good doing it over email. It doesn't work. So there are limits. I think this important point that I should make against myself. There's a limit to how new stories can. The world isn't totally plastic in this. You can't change the world through these stories. Older people will want to see a healthcare professional face to face because of a whole generation of experiences, and how we designate allied healthcare professionals, how we increase the size of the primary care team, and so we give them the disappointment of not seeing a GP, but there's a warm body you're talking to and they're listening and doing something, is, I think, the trick that I hope the Fuller report is all about, right? And so there will be disappointment there. And there will be disappointment at the other end of the GP who's going to lose something. But what I found with them at the moment is, very graphic stories of people never seeing their kids and things like this, and so if you did this thing, you could help your son with your homework, right? That's the narrative. And it's a loss, but think of the gain of helping your son with the homework.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that helpful question, Richard, and the answers, Paul. So I am going to draw it to a close this time and thank Paul very much indeed for that perspective on how to effect change. Just to say that the slides and a recording of this session will be available on the NHS IMAS website in due course. And there is a brief evaluation form in the chat if anyone gets a chance to have a look at that. But thank you so much, Paul, for giving your time and for a really, really interesting and helpful presentation. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye everyone.